Indiana's record-breaking floods have devastated the Hoosier State throughout history, from the catastrophic deluge of 1913 that killed hundreds to the current crisis unfolding right now in March 2006. What makes Indiana such a magnet for flooding disasters might surprise you, and the patterns emerging tell a troubling story about our changing climate. Right now, as I'm speaking to you, the East Fork White River at Seymour is approaching an all-time record flood level of more than 19 feet. That's 7 feet above flood stage. This isn't just another spring flood. Between 3 and 6 inches of rain have pummeled central and southern Indiana this week, pushing rivers to breaking points across multiple counties. The National Weather Service has issued flood warnings that stretch from Bartholomew to Brown County, and more rain is coming. Monroe Lake Reservoir upstream provides some flood control protection, but even this infrastructure is being overwhelmed. To understand why this matters, we need to go back over a century to when Mother Nature unleashed her full fury on the Hoosier State. March 23rd, 1913. The date that forever changed how Indiana thinks about flooding. Picture this scene. Cold Arctic air masses collided with warm, humid air from the Gulf Coast directly over Indiana, creating a weather pattern so violent it would claim between 100 and 200 lives in the state alone. Across 13 states, 650 people would die in what became known as the Great Flood of 1913. The numbers from that disaster still stagger scientists today. In Indianapolis, floodwaters reached an estimated 19.5 feet above flood stage. When an earthen levee failed on the city's near west side, a 25-foot wall of water thundered through the city. Imagine that, a wall of water taller than a 2-story house. 4,000 people fled their homes in panic. The city's transportation and water supply were crippled for 4 days. 7,000 Indianapolis families lost everything. Fort Wayne got hammered even worse. The flood washed out entire neighborhoods, damaging 15,000 citizens homeless. That's roughly 1 in 5 residents of the entire city rendered homeless by a single weather event. But the most jaw-dropping sight was what happened to the Wabash River. This normally modest waterway became an inland sea nearly 7 miles wide. 7 miles. Between Vincennes and Lawrenceville, Illinois, the river averaged 5 to 7 feet deep across this massive expanse. Entire communities simply vanished under the brown, churning water. The damage estimates exceeded $250 million across the Midwest. That's over $8 billion in today's money. Indiana alone suffered $25 million in damages, equivalent to roughly $750 today. More than 250,000 people were left homeless across the affected states. In Peru, Indiana, something almost surreal happened. A traveling circus lost most of its animals in the storm. Picture elephants and exotic animals struggling against the raging floodwaters. It reads like something out of a disaster movie, but it was terrifyingly real. The flood's aftermath brought new horrors. As temperatures plummeted from the 60s to the 20s and snow began falling, typhoid fever spread through the contaminated water supplies, claiming even more lives in the weeks that followed. The snow was actually a blessing because it inhibited mold growth in the thousands of damaged buildings. But nothing could stop the spread of disease through the devastated communities. Indiana Governor Samuel M. Ralston had to appeal to other states for relief assistance. The concept of federal disaster aid didn't exist yet, so communities were largely on their own. But 1913 wasn't Indiana's only encounter with catastrophic flooding. 24 years later, nature struck again with what many consider the greatest Ohio River flood in recorded history. The winter of 1937 was brutal. January and February brought relentless precipitation that turned the Ohio River into a monster. From Pittsburgh to Cairo, Illinois, the destruction was total. 385 people died. 1 million people were left homeless. Property losses reached $500 million, equivalent to over $11 billion today. In Evansville, Indiana, the situation became so desperate that martial law was declared. The Ohio River rose to a record 53.74 feet, nearly 20 feet above flood stage. To put that in perspective, that's like your house being underwater up to the second-floor windows. The flood caused $13 million in damage across 6 Indiana counties alone. The Works Progress Administration coordinated massive relief efforts, creating a federal model for disaster response that would influence future policies. Several businesses never recovered, including the famous Rose Island amusement park near Charlestown on the Indiana side of the river. This beloved entertainment destination simply couldn't rebuild after the devastation. An entire piece of Indiana's cultural landscape vanished beneath the muddy waters. These historical floods shaped modern flood control efforts. After 1913, communities began implementing levee systems and flood control measures. After 1937, the federal government became much more involved in flood mitigation through the Flood Control Act of 1936. These disasters literally changed how America approaches water management. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers began developing comprehensive flood control infrastructure that we still rely on today. Fast forward to March 1982, and Indiana faced another major flooding crisis. This time it was northern Indiana that bore the brunt. More than 10,000 people were forced to evacuate their homes. Damage exceeded $50 million, about $150 million in today's dollars. But here's where the story gets interesting. Sandbagging efforts prevented an additional $30 in damages. The lessons learned from previous disasters actually worked. Communities had organized response systems. People knew how to fight back against the rising waters. President Ronald Reagan even joined sandbagging efforts in Fort Wayne, bringing national attention to Indiana's flooding crisis. Then came the flood that changed everything about how we think about modern disaster response. June 2008. Governor Mitch Daniels would later say total damages were expected to top $1 billion. This wasn't just another flood. It was the second costliest natural disaster in Indiana history, and the worst flood in the state's modern era. Columbus, Indiana became the poster child for this disaster. The city was completely isolated by floodwater for almost an entire day. Imagine that, a thriving community of 44,000 people cut off from the outside world by water. Mayor Jim Leonhoop captured the surreal nature of the event. It was a calamity. There was water where I had no idea water would ever go, or ever had been. The flood struck without warning. Heavy rainfall occurred upstream in Haw Creek, a small stream flowing through Columbus. Most residents had no idea what was coming because the rain was miles away. Suddenly, a wall of water came roaring through the center of town. Bartholomew County Emergency Management Director Shannon Cook described it perfectly. It was hectic, fast-paced, and chaotic. Columbus Regional Hospital became an evacuation nightmare. When 13 feet of water, 130 million gallons, flooded the basement, 157 patients had to be emergency evacuated. The hospital shut down for over 4 months. More than 70 businesses were damaged, with the hospital alone suffering $125 million in damage. This wasn't just an urban disaster. The June 2008 flood became Indiana's largest agricultural disaster ever, affecting 9% of the state's farmland. Agricultural costs alone exceeded $800 million. 39 Indiana counties were declared federal disaster areas. Nearly 3,000 homes were damaged, and almost 1,000 people had to be evacuated. The U.S. Geological Survey recorded new peak streamflow records at 9 locations. Hydrologist Scott Morlock called it the worst flooding in Indiana's modern history. Recurrence intervals, the statistical likelihood of such floods, were estimated at greater than 100 years at 5 monitoring stations. This was supposed to be a once-in-a-century event. But here's where the story takes an ominous turn. These once-in-a-century floods are happening more frequently. Scientists are questioning whether the statistical models we use to predict flooding are still valid. Since 1895, Indiana's average annual temperature has increased by 1.2 degrees Fahrenheit. According to the Indiana Climate Change Impacts Assessment from Purdue University and findings from the National Climate Assessment, temperatures could rise by up to 6 degrees Fahrenheit by 2050. That might not sound like much, but it's creating fundamental changes in precipitation patterns. Indiana is becoming wetter, but the increase is coming primarily in winter and spring, exactly when the state is most vulnerable to flooding. Climate projections show winter precipitation could increase by 21% and spring precipitation by 30% by the end of this century. This isn't just more rain, it's rain at the worst possible times. The increased precipitation won't help crops during growing season, but it will dramatically increase flooding risks. The concept of stationarity, the idea that what happened in the past predicts what will happen in the future, no longer applies to extreme weather events. High-impact, low-probability events like 100-year floods or 500-year rainfall events shape how we build drainage systems, price insurance, and decide where to build houses. But if these rare events are becoming more common, everything we thought we knew about flood risk needs to be reconsidered. This brings us to today's crisis. The flooding happening right now in March 2026 is following the same dangerous patterns we've seen throughout Indiana's history. The East Fork White River at Seymour crested at 19.49 feet, just shy of the catastrophic levels seen in 1913. Between Tuesday and Thursday of this week, 3.5 to 5.75 inches of rain fell across the region. The East Fork White River at Seymour crested near 17.8 feet Friday morning, inundating over half the floodplain in Jackson County. The White River at Elliston and Newberry crested near 24.8 feet early Saturday and remained above flood stage through March 11th. Counties including Bartholomew, Decatur, Johnson, Shelby, and Brown were under active flood warnings. At 19.4 feet, Lower Rockford Road just south of Reddington Road became impassable, cutting off communities and emergency services. What was particularly concerning is that more rain was forecast through the weekend, an additional 1 to 3 inches on already saturated ground. The pattern was identical to what we've seen in past disasters: prolonged precipitation events that push river systems beyond their capacity. The fog that residents woke up to Thursday morning was actually another warning sign. Dense fog often forms when warm, moist air moves over cooler surfaces, the same atmospheric setup that can produce heavy rainfall and flooding. Indiana suffered no known flood fatalities in 2024, the first time since 2017. It's a testament to improved forecasting, better emergency management, and lessons learned from disasters like 2008. But nationally, flooding killed 181 people last year, making it the deadliest thunderstorm-related hazard. The historical pattern is clear and troubling. Indiana's position makes it a natural battleground between competing air masses. Cold northern air and warm, humid Gulf Coast air clash over the state with increasing frequency and intensity. In winter and spring, this creates extended rain events. In summer, it produces severe thunderstorms capable of dumping incredible amounts of water in short periods. The 1913 flood taught us that Indiana could experience truly catastrophic flooding. The 1937 flood showed us that river systems could become inland seas. The 2008 flood demonstrated that modern infrastructure isn't immune to nature's fury. And the 2026 flood that just happened reminded us that these patterns are accelerating. Looking at the long arc of Indiana's flood history, several troubling trends emerge. The intervals between major floods are shortening, the intensity of individual events is increasing, the geographical footprint of damage is expanding, and our statistical models for predicting these events are becoming unreliable. John H. Patterson, founder of the Dayton-based National Cash Register Company, became an unlikely hero during the 1913 flood. When Dayton's mayor was trapped in his house, Patterson essentially took over municipal functions. He had his factory build boats and organized rescue operations that saved thousands of lives. His story reminds us that catastrophic flooding requires extraordinary community response. That spirit of community resilience runs through every major flood in Indiana's history. From the sandbagging efforts that saved millions in damages in 1982, to the coordinated evacuations that prevented mass casualties in 2008, to the emergency management protocols that were implemented during the 2026 event. But individual heroism and community spirit can only do so much against the forces of nature. The data tells us we're entering an era of more frequent, more intense flooding events. The question isn't whether Indiana will face another catastrophic flood, it's when, and whether we'll be ready. As the East Fork White River finally receded from its record crest, we witnessed another chapter in Indiana's long, complicated relationship with water. Each flood teaches us something new about the power of nature and the vulnerability of human communities. Each disaster forces us to reconsider what we think we know about risk and resilience. The floods of 1913, 1937, 1982, and 2008 weren't just natural disasters. They were turning points that reshaped how Indiana thinks about water, weather, and the future. The flood of 2026 has already written its own chapter in that ongoing story, reminding us that in the battle between human engineering and natural forces, nature usually wins. Standing at this moment in history, having watched another potentially record-breaking flood unfold in real time, we can see how the threads of Indiana's past, present, and future are all connected by the common element of water. These floods aren't just weather events. They're the state's way of reminding us that we live on nature's terms, not our own.